This is section 3 of the Odyssey, retold by Gillian Cross. The Giant in the Cave. They awoke to a beautiful clear dawn and a fine view. Their ships had run aground in a natural harbor, safely away from the wild open sea. Behind the harbor was a stretch of rich grassland with luxuriant woods beyond. The place seemed to have everything they needed. Huge bunches of grapes grew on wild vines, and a spring of fresh water ran down into the harbor. Looking up at the wooded hills, Odysseus saw a herd of wild goats leaping from rock to rock. "The gods must have brought us here," he said. He and his men took their bows and spears and went off to hunt the goats. In a very short time they had enough meat to last for days, and they discovered that the island was uninhabited. At last it was safe to rest and relax. They feasted on roasted meat, washed down with the wine they'd looted from the Cicones. Afterward they lay on the beach, gazing across to the mainland. They heard the sound of voices drifting over the water and the bleating of sheep and goats. And they saw smoke rising into the evening sky from fires like theirs. Idly, as the sun went down, they wondered what kind of people lived over there. They peered across at the dark shore, but no human figures were visible, and however hard they tried, they couldn't make out what the voices were saying. Still listening, the sailors fell asleep, one by one, beside the embers of their fires. Only Odysseus stayed awake, looking across the water. As the sky grew black and the stars came out, he stared at the glimmering light of the distant fires. What was over there? Whose voices could they hear? As soon as the sun rose, Odysseus was on his feet, giving orders to his men as they awoke. 11 ships must stay here to take on food and fresh water, he said, but I'll take my own ship over to the mainland to see what sort of people live there. He signaled to his crew, and they followed him into the water. Clambering on board their ship, they took up their oars. It wasn't worth raising the sail, so they rowed the short distance to the opposite shore. Because they were rowing, they were facing backward. It was only when they turned the ship ready to anchor that they had their first close look at the place where they were going to land. It was a strange, unsettling sight. A little way back from the shore, they saw the entrance to a vast cave, shadowed by laurel bushes. In front of the cave was a huge sheep pen made of great blocks of rough-cut stone. Every block was taller than a man. What kind of creature could build like that? The sailors glanced nervously at one another, and someone muttered that they ought to row straight back to the island. But Odysseus was curious. He bit his lip thoughtfully, making a plan. "Most of you must stay and guard the ship," he said. "I'll take 12 men with me to explore that cave." He chose 12 of the best and bravest and ordered them to pack up some food. Then he filled a big wineskin with rich, strong wine and jumped into the water to wade ashore. He and his 12 companions crept up the beach toward the towering sheep pen. Peering through a crack in the wall, they saw that it was full of lambs, but there were no adult sheep. Odysseus guessed that the main flock was up in the high pastures with their shepherd, whoever he was, whatever he was. That gave them a chance to explore the cave. Odysseus crept cautiously up to the entrance, beckoning his men to follow. When their eyes adjusted to the darkness inside, they saw an amazing sight. The cave was very high and deep, and it was full of gigantic baskets and bowls. The baskets were filled with cheeses the size of cartwheels, and the bowls were brimming with milk and whey. "Look at all this food!" cried one of the sailors. "There are enough cheeses and lambs to last us all the way back to Ithaca." "We don't need to come as looters," Odysseus said. "I've brought gifts for the owner of this cave. He'll give us gifts in return, out of politeness, and then we'll have all the meat and cheese we need. And we'll have made a new friend, not an enemy." His men were still nervous, but he persuaded them to stay. Taking dry wood from a stack at the back of the cave, they built themselves a fire and settled down to wait for the owner to return. They heard him before they saw him. Thud, thud, thud. His footsteps shook the ground ahead of him. In 3 strides he had reached the cave, and he was driving his sheep inside. A huge bundle of firewood flew in after them, and then came the giant himself. His massive body blocked out the light as he stooped to walk through the entrance. When Odysseus and his men saw that vast, dark shape, they rushed to the back of the cave to hide in the shadows. By the time they turned around to take another look, the monster was blocking the entrance of the cave with a great slab of stone. They were trapped. Shivering in the corner, they watched him sniff at the dying embers of their fire. His massive head turned left and right, peering around. Then he heaped more wood onto the fire. The flames shot up, and they saw his face for the first time. It was broad and ugly, with a jutting nose and a thick, heavy jaw. In the center of his forehead was a single, hideous eye, his only one. They were trapped in the cave of a cyclops. The monster milked his sheep, guzzling down the first bucketful in a single gulp. He set the rest of the milk aside to curdle for making cheese, and then he built up the fire again, piling the wood so high that the red glare lit up the cave. This time he looked around more carefully, searching for intruders. When he saw Odysseus and his men, he bellowed, "Sheep stealers!" "We're not thieves," Odysseus said, stepping forward boldly. "We're Greek soldiers, sailing home from the war in Troy." The Cyclops peered suspiciously at him. "Sailing? Where's your ship, then?" Odysseus certainly wasn't going to tell him that. He made a sad face and gazed up at the giant. "Our ship was wrecked," he said. "Poseidon, the earth shaker, whipped up a great storm and swamped it, and we are the only men who didn't drown. Please, give us food and shelter." The Cyclops laughed scornfully. Instead of answering, he reached out and grabbed two of Odysseus's men. Cramming them into his mouth, he gulped them down, grinning as the other sailors shouted in horror. Then he guzzled another bucketful of milk and sprawled on the floor, falling asleep immediately. His body was like a mountain, filling half the cave.